Hi, my name is Jorge Castillo, and I'm the clinical director of the Waldenstrom's program at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. And today I wanted to talk to you about the clinical developments in emerging therapies for patients with Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia, specifically in the context of what was discussed at the International Workshop for Waldenstrom's, the 12th one, that recently taken place in Prague in the Czech Republic. It was an amazing meeting. I think it was one of the highest attendance we have seen for the workshop since its foundation. We have about 400 in-person attendees and about 39 countries represented in that meeting. So it was very exciting to see the amount of research from the basic, translational, and clinical that had been taking place, over the last couple of years since the last meeting in Madrid a couple of years ago. So I wanted just to focus a little bit more on what was discussed, specifically newer trends and newer treatment options for patients with Waldenstrom's. As we all know, Waldenstrom's is a condition that is chronic. There are multiple very effective treatment options, but as patients live longer, we obviously need newer treatments that could benefit our patients as well. So I'm going to kind of divide this discussion in two large groups. I think we have a group of therapies called targeted therapies, and I'm going to focus on that. And then we have a novel, area of research focusing more on immunotherapies. So I'm going to kind of just focus on that a little bit later as well. So talking about targeted therapies, targeted therapies refer to medications that specifically block a pathway that malignant cells tend to use to either survive longer, or outlive the normal life of the cells in our bodies. So a classic example of these are covalent BTK inhibitors, which are currently in the market, readily available to treat patients with Waldenstrom's. And that includes ibrutinib, acalabrutinib, and zanubrutinib as well. So there is a new family of BTK inhibitors called non-covalent BTK inhibitors. And I think one of the important updates that were given at the workshop was the emerging data with pirtobrutinib. So pirtobrutinib, again, is a non-covalent BTK inhibitor. It's an oral agent as well, which is taken indefinitely all the way until disease progression or unacceptable toxicity. But the responses on patients who were already progressing on the covalent BTK inhibitors was actually very encouraging, very much in the range of about 70%. And I would say more than half of the patients experience benefits beyond 2 to 3 years. So this is a line of therapy that has become more and more used now in the United States. It's now part of the recommendations to treat patients with Waldenstrom's whose disease has relapsed or recurred. And it's a great option. The side effects are minor. We still see a little bit of rashes and GI issues, but those are very minor. And the risk of bleeding and arrhythmias, which is something that we saw routinely with covalent BTK inhibitors, seem to be less pronounced as well with these new agents. So very exciting data. The other BTK acting agents of interest are the BTK degraders. So kind of differentiate a little bit between BTK inhibitors and BTK degraders. The BTK inhibitors do inhibit BTK, yes, but its own action, that's the name. But the BTK degraders, what they do is they bind to BTK and actually degrade BTK, basically removes BTK from the system. And that actually has an efficacy that goes beyond of what BTK inhibitors do. And in the data that was presented, specifically for there are at least 2 or 3 BTK inhibitors in the market, at least in clinical trials. We have BGB-16673 and we have NX-5498. These data that were presented in patients with Waldenstrom's is a little early, but we do see efficacy even in patients who have been exposed to covalent and non-covalent BTK inhibitors. They can still benefit from BTK degraders, right? Obviously, the durability of this benefit is still unclear, but it seems to me that this is one of the most important developments that I've seen in terms of continue to attack BTK and get benefit of BTK inhibition or degradation in patients with Waldenstrom's. Obviously, longer-term follow-up is necessary. Larger studies, larger sample are needed. to understand, the true benefit as well as the durability of this benefit in patients with Waldenstrom's. The other targeted agents of interest are the new BCL2 inhibitors. So venetoclax is a BCL2 inhibitor approved already in the United States to treat CLL or in acute myeloid leukemia. It's also part of the guidelines to treat patients with relapsed Waldenstrom's based on a study that was published a few years ago. But there's a new generation of BCL2 inhibitors, and the one that that the data was presented was actually sonrotoclax. It's a second generation BCL2 inhibitor, and in the laboratory has shown to be effective even in cells that were resistant to venetoclax. So that's actually very interesting. As with any other BCL2 inhibitor, there's a ramp-up process in which patients are exposed to lower doses of these medications, and a few days later, the doses keep increasing all the way to a max. So this is a study that is ongoing. There are multiple sites all over the country in the United States and outside the United States as well. And so far, the data seems to be very encouraging as well. So this is another line of therapy that seems to be interesting. Beyond that, what we're trying to do nowadays is try to combine, these different pathways, because as it seems to me that either BTK inhibitors or BCL2 inhibitors, most of the benefit are seen with, prolonged or indefinite duration therapy. So in the laboratory and in other conditions, in other medical conditions, there have been a combination of BCL2 inhibitors and BTK inhibitors. And that is, something that is being investigated currently. Some data were presented with the combination of pirtobrutinib and venetoclax. So that's a study that was being run currently and is currently accruing. And some data presented at the workshop actually showed, to be very promising. The other combination on that same vein is actually combining zanubrutinib and sonrotoclax. This is a combination that is going to start being utilized specifically in patients who have not been treated before. This is a frontline treatment. It's actually very interesting. And it seems to me, at least, that this concurrent inhibition of BTK and BCL2, might be a very powerful combination. The idea is to provide patients with a, all oral, non-chemo, but fixed duration therapy rather than therapy that is indefinite all the way to disease progression or toxicity. The other combinations of interest that we also saw is trying to add these targeted agents, BTK inhibitors specifically, to chemotherapy or to rituximab-containing regimens. So very exciting data was presented with the combination of acalabrutinib, bendamustine, and rituximab. This is the BROM study that has completed accrual in Canada, and the results so far look very promising in terms of the depth of the response. We need to understand a bit more the durability of this response, but this is a very interesting study. And there's a study combining zanubrutinib, bendamustine, and rituximab in China that is ongoing accrual, and a study in the United States that will start hopefully very soon. All these studies, again, are specifically directed at taking advantage of BTK inhibitors and their efficacy, but without having to expose patients to therapy indefinitely, which, in my opinion, can help with the cost of these medications, decrease potentially toxicity associated with these medications, and also the possibility of maybe retreat in the future if you are treated for a short period without having to develop resistance to these therapies. So I think in terms of targeted agents, that's pretty much what was the most interesting data presented at the workshop. Now, I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk about a little bit about immunotherapies. So immunotherapy is a line of research that has been taking place very importantly in lymphomas in general terms, and as well in some types of leukemias. And that relates to three different groups of treatment. So one of them is what we call antibody-drug conjugates. And these are antibodies, very much like, rituximab or daratumumab. But these antibodies are actually weaponized. So they do have a payload, and they take advantage of the fact that the antibody can detect the malignant cells, and then it can bind to them, and then maybe introduce a payload into these malignant cells to kind of target their destruction. So antibodies or conjugates are very important. There's another line of therapies called phospholipid drug conjugates, in which they use similar mechanisms, using kind of the sensitivity of the lipid rafts, of the density of lipid rafts in the malignant cells to basically introduce a radioisotope within the malignant cells to induce their death. We do have also what we call bispecific antibodies, which are antibodies that are designed to have one arm to catch the malignant cells and one arm to attract the T cells or the immune-mediated cells of our own body. And by maybe putting the cancer cells and the anti-cancer cells of our system, close together, they can actually induce the destruction of these cells as well. And finally, we have the CAR T cells, which are these T cells that have been re-educated to be able to attack the cancer cells in a more significant manner. So there was some data presented with an antibody drug conjugate called loncastuximab. This is an ongoing clinical trial. This is a trial that is being run as a network within the United States with some very early promising efficacy data. The toxicity that we see with loncastuximab so far has been a bit of rash, and a bit of swelling, and some liver enzyme elevations. Very typical of what we have seen in previous experiences with loncastuximab for other types of lymphomas. In the terms of the phospholipid drug conjugates, we have iopofosine I-131. That study actually has completed accrual, and there were some data presented showing high efficacy. And we are hopefully going to hear more details about this during ASH, which is going to be an oral presentation at ASH. So we're looking forward to what we have to do. This iopofosine I-131 is a study called the CLOVER-WhAM, and this was done in actually a heavily pretreated population. So most patients had already been exposed to chemotherapy, to rituximab, to BTK inhibitors, and despite this fact, the responses induced by this agent were very high. In terms of the bispecific antibodies, we don't really have a lot of data in Waldenstrom's, but there are at least two trials, one in the United States and one in Europe. They're going to be evaluating epcoritamab. Epcoritamab is a bispecific antibody in which one arm is directed against CD20, which is a classic marker that is overexpressed in patients in the malignant cells of patients with Waldenstrom's. And the other arm is a CD3 marker, which basically will attract T cells to be in close proximity to the cancer cells. So epcoritamab is approved already in the United States for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, but there are, at least again, there's a study in the United States and one in Europe that are going to be opening very soon to evaluate the efficacy of these bispecific antibodies in patients with Waldenstrom's. And finally, we have the CAR T cells. Unfortunately, fortunately, they have shown to be highly effective in early experiments, but really larger studies in Waldenstrom's at this time are not being conducted. There were a couple of projects that were being planned, but for some reason they did not crystallize. So we're still waiting, hopefully, for the best potential CAR T cell product to be introduced, to treat patients with Waldenstrom's. So I would say, in a nutshell, the horizon in terms of therapies for patients with Waldenstrom seems to be bright, seems to be hopeful, seems to be productive, and multiple treatment options for the future. Obviously, we're still aiming for inducing deep responses. We're still aiming to hopefully try to cure the disease at some point in the future. But it was very encouraging, at least for me, to see that there's so many people working on trying to improve the treatments for patients with Waldenstrom's all over the world.